I know you don't like to front run the president, but can you give us any clarity on what we're expecting here in terms of tariffs on Chinese products or restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States?
Well, I'm certainly not going to get ahead of the president on this topic. I believe his announcement will be forthcoming very, very shortly. The purpose of the whole thing is to try to curb the problems that we've found with intellectual property rights, forced technology transfers, forced partnerships, that kind of thing, forced licensing, cybersecurity breaches, all sorts of problems that are designed to penetrate and vitiate the intellectual property rights of American high-tech companies.
Is tariffs the answer there, sir? Because some would look at this and say, actually, a lot of the technology that they then use is sold within China, and actually tariffs on incoming goods is not going to crack down on what we've seen.
Well, I don't think that's quite true. There are codes and things embedded within high-tech situations that are not that easy to get from the outside or by designing backward from the finished product. If there were, the Chinese wouldn't be requiring all the massive technology licensing and technology transfers that they do. So the fact that they're doing that speaks for itself.
What is the message that we're trying to send to China at this moment, Mr. Secretary? Is it that, look, the United States is preparing for a possible trade war here? Or is it, look, we're ratcheting up the pressure, but we want to bring you to the table to do a deal?
Well, I think it's something quite different from that. In terms of the steel and aluminum tariffs, the message was we're trying to protect our present. Those are present-day products. In terms of intellectual property, the message is we're trying to protect the future, because the intellectual property of today is the important finished product of tomorrow. So the message is very straightforward. We don't mind competition that's fair and square, regardless of where it comes from. We do mind competition that is based on violations of fundamental intellectual property rights. To give you a feeling how important this is, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, which is also part of the Department of Commerce, sometime this summer will issue its 10 millionth patent. There's no country on earth that has ever issued anything remotely like 10 million patents. That is the key to a lot of America's success, is technological leadership. We cannot afford to have that stolen or strong-armed away from us.
I understand, sir, and I feel like the strong arm, the aggression is now coming from the United States to take action, but that's the stick. What about the carrot here? No, that's not strong-arming.
We're not strong-arming. We're finally coming to our own defense against abuses that have been going on for years and years.
What's the plan to make a deal, though? I understand the stick approach. What about the carrot here at the same time? What is the plan to make a deal?
Well, negotiation should be done in the conference room, not in the press room. But you might want to take a look at the recent arrangements with the Republic of Korea. There, we found that there were lots of problems with their exports to us of steel and aluminum. So we included them on the list that was to be put 25% tariff on steel products from Republic of Korea to us and 10% on aluminum. We then went in, there were negotiations, and the outcome of the negotiations was several-fold. First, they agreed to a 30% reduction from the average steel exports they were sending to us during the 3-year period, 2015 through 2017. That amounts to about 1,200,000 ton reduction. That's approximately what we reckon would have been the outcome had the tariffs been put in place. So what we were able to negotiate was something that was more agreeable to the Koreans and yet achieved exactly the same purpose as the tariffs would have. And the agreement was coupled by some improvements in our situation vis-a-vis Republic of Korea in terms of automobiles. First of all, it doubled the quotas that we can send in without tariff, from 25,000 cars to 50,000 cars.
Mr. Secretary, it does sound like progress, but China's a very different story to South Korea here. And I'm glad that you mentioned that the conference room and thrashing out a deal, because you, of anybody, knows how to make a deal here. Can I ask if the Treasury Secretary, who spoke about progress at the weekend, has plans to go to China and get in a room with the right people in China and thrash out a deal? Does he plan to go to China?
Well, there have been plenty of discussions ongoing with China before, during, and presumably after current events. So there's no lack of discussion. What's changed is the positioning of the United States, and I don't think you should discount the Korean situation at all. People were screaming and yelling before the deal was made, oh, well, Korea is going to blow up. The trade with Korea will blow up. It will ruin American agricultural exports to Korea. All of that turned out to be unfounded. And I think at some point the critics of the administration, same ones who said we couldn't grow at more than 1.5% or so, and they were wrong.
Mr. Secretary, I have pretty good information that the Chinese don't really understand what the stance is from the United States here and actually how you managed to thrash out a deal. And you have to understand that the cultural differences and what diplomacy here also requires, in addition to announcing these measures. Do you agree that it's right that the Treasury Secretary, or indeed yourself, sir, needs to go to China and talk to the right people in order to get a deal, rather than having an apparent face-off, as we seem to have at this moment?
We had a big conference between the U.S. and China at Mar-a-Lago almost a year ago. We had a session between the Chinese government and the U.S. government, a big sit-down in the middle of the summer. We had another huge one, including presidential visit to China last fall. There are people going back and forth all the time. There are telephone conversations all the time. There are written correspondences all the time. There's no lack of communication between the United States and China.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Can I also ask you about Europe, too? Because the EU Trade Commissioner has said that between the two of you, you've said that you will try and get a mandate to thrash out a broader trade deal with the EU. Can you get a mandate from Congress to agree a broader trade deal with the EU? And how would that differ from the transatlantic trade agreement that was being attempted?
Well, first of all, the TTIP, which was the earlier proposal for an agreement between the European Commission and the United States, was never completed. I would judge that it was more or less 50% done at the time when the negotiations stopped. But you'll notice when the president was elected and inaugurated, he terminated the Trans-Pacific deal. He did not terminate TTIP. That was meant quite deliberately and quite overtly as a message that we're open to discussions with the European Commission. And he has signaled that several times since, at the G7, at the G20, and in various public addresses. So the idea that there's a willingness on the part of our administration to engage with the European Commission is nothing new. That's been a long-standing objective. What has provoked the recent discussions is the imposition of the tariffs, the 25% on steel and the 10% on aluminum. The President has suspended those, along with those to several other countries, temporarily, in order to give us a fairly brief time during which we can negotiate some settlements that will reduce overall trade tensions. So this is a logical continuation, from our point of view, of a series of overtures that have been made for a long, long time.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, can I ask what your message is to investors, to consumers, to those that perhaps are worried that the United States is willing to go all the way on a trade war, that actually a deal we're here with China is what this administration is planning?
Well, I would recommend that investors act rationally. And by that, what I mean is judge this administration by the actual performance that it creates. Don't judge it by some sort of hallucination about some boogeyman out there that could be a problem. I think people are altogether too hysterical, and I think that calmness is going to be a much more useful investment tool than hysteria.
So don't trade on the rhetoric. Is that the message? Trade on the deals?
What I'm suggesting is that people were exercised about, oh, there'll be great inflation from the tariffs. You perhaps saw in my prior presentations on TV, you're talking a fraction of a penny on a can of beer. You're talking a fraction of a penny on a can of soup. You're talking a fraction of a penny on a can of Coke. You're talking something under 1% on the price of a car. These are not economy-wrecking ideas. These are very, very small things. In total, the total amount of the tariffs, if you assume that they were fully passed through to our economy, it's something under 0.5%. Big deal. This economy is not so fragile that a fraction of a percent is going to upset either the market or the economy. So I think people can easily blow things totally out of proportion, and I think rational investors don't act that way. I think rational investors work with the numbers and try to think through what are the real implications, not what's some wild fantasy.